Hi, and welcome to the Pilgrim Path podcast. I'm Pastor Chris Surber, the pastor of First Congregational Church of Naples, and also the founder and executive director of Supply and Multiply, a ministry organization my family and I founded while living in Haiti, along with a whole bunch of friends, mission team members, and partners, and folks living in Haiti that helped to get that ministry going. It's now expanding into other countries as we're doing a lot of other work and continuing our activities in Haiti through Haiti's current greatly difficult times. And so anyway, it is my pleasure today to be here with Pastor Justin Nierer. He is the pastor of Sandstone Congregational Church in Jackson, Michigan. That's right? That's make sure I say it right. And it's a wonderful place, and I love seeing the life of ministry that's happening at that place. And so, hey, welcome, Justin. I appreciate you taking the time to do this with me. Absolutely. And so this morning or today, what I had in mind to talk about, what we've sort of set as a general starting place, is these series of articles that Justin writes in the Congregationalist magazine. I, too, am privileged to write in this magazine occasionally and fairly regularly, but it seems like just about every one I check out what's been going on in the life of Mrs. Peabody. And I love these things because as a writer and a communicator, I think it's awesome the way that you've developed this, it really exposing church life, making valuable insight, presenting valuable insights through the narrative of this series of articles that you've written.
Right.
And let's talk about it. Let's get into it.
Sure. Well, let's see. Well, I guess we can start in the beginning and talk about. Let's talk about her. For those of you who are not familiar, who are listening to this podcast, not familiar with the Congregationalists or the NACCC, National Association of Congregational Christian Churches, it's our magazine. It's the association's magazine. I don't know how many decades it's been going. Very, very long.
You can find them online, archives going. I don't know how old this thing is. Well into the 1800s, I think.
So the Congregational magazine, and anyway, so a number of years ago actually now, the editor at the time, Marion King, she was looking for material. And I'm not a scholar per se. I'm not this guy that, enjoys writing theology or, but I really enjoy writing, just stories and things that I've experienced and just to kind of use that as example, almost not just sermon illustrations, but, like you said, to interact with church life and such. So I had been using, so I came up with a character for sermons that encompasses all these negative attributes, if you will, of a church member or things that have happened or bad decisions that a church member made that I can't use their real name or maybe it's so embellished that I'm just trying to teach a lesson.
Right.
So I came up with this woman named Mrs. Peabody.
Yeah.
And for the longest time, I don't know if she has a first name. I have been asked if she has a first name. I just kind of call her Mrs. Peabody.
Right.
Well, anyway, the congregation here at Sandstone enjoyed this so much. I thought to myself, I could take this further. So when Marion asked for material, I wrote a story. And the first one was called Mrs. Peabody and the 12 Bibles. And Mrs. Peabody and the 12 Bibles actually, and this is another question people ask me, is this true? Some of the things that she goes through or she's done have happened. Right. And some of the things I kind of, I stretch it out to make it more humorous and such. But Mrs. Peabody and the 12 Bibles actually did happen. I was a very young pastor. It was my first senior solo pastorate. And one of the first Sundays that I was at that church, I said, hey, we're going to open the Word of God. It's going to be up on the screen. But if you don't have a Bible, take the one from the pew.
Right.
Just take one from. We have plenty. Just take if you want to take a Bible home, take one from the pew. Well, the very next morning, I get a phone call from Mrs. Peabody, and she says, I gave those Bibles. I gave a number of those Bibles in memory or in honor of family and friends. I don't want you to give them out. So she arrived at the church. She arrived at the church that day and went through every Bible of every pew. She opened, she saw if it was given by her. If it was, she put it off to the side. She ended up with 12 Bibles.
Right.
I was dumbfounded, Chris. I mean, what do you do? Just like
early in ministry.
So what I did was I found a box for her. I helped her put them in her car, and the whole time I was completely silent because I thought this cannot be happening. Woman cannot. This is the weirdest, craziest thing.
Yeah.
And then a number of years later, and I think I mentioned this in the story, but a number of years later, I visited her in her home. She was having some medical issues. Visiting her in her home, I'm sitting there in her living room on the bookshelf in her living room are the 12 Bibles lined up. Just sitting there. To this day, I don't know why she felt that this was so bad that we were giving out these Bibles, and such. So that actually happened. Another thing that one of the most popular ones that I wrote was Mrs. Peabody and the funeral beans. Now that article, I wish I kept the email. But that article, that story, I got an email from a church in California, a small church in California, who there was an incident, there was something happened, there was a last minute emergency, and they did not have a preacher or a pastor 10 minutes before service was going to start. Something happened.
Yeah.
And so the moderator of the church found that story and said, you know what, I'm going to read this. During the service time, and we're going to talk about it. And that whole story is about just church conflict over a petty thing. And if you don't know the story, it was there's a church board meeting, and Mrs. Peabody storms into the church board meeting, and she wants to remove a woman from membership because she used her funeral beans for a church potluck. And this can of green bean, this can of Sam's Club, Costco size green beans, was used for something else besides a funeral dinner. And Mrs. Peabody was in charge of the funeral dinners, and she thought this was absolutely wrong. And so what happens is that there's a church board member, and this, in his a senior gentleman, a senior churchman, who finally says, "We're talking about a can of green beans. We're talking about an inanimate object. We're talking about a can of green beans. Are you being serious right now?" And Mr. Peabody, kind of pushes back, and this senior gentleman finally says, "We're not doing this. Right. We're not doing this. I will go out and I will buy you more green. I will buy you more green beans."
Oh man! Thank God for those men and women in the
I will do
that too.
No, I will do this.
Yeah,
but the funny thing. Here's something that happened though. That they read that during that service, and then a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, Andrew McHenry. He actually used that as a sermon illustration. He used the same story as a sermon illustration to talk about, church conflict and such. But that was the only story throughout all the Mrs. Peabody. That was the only story that there was actually an editor to the letter, a letter to the editor. The Marian actually got a letter to the editor from a woman whose mom was in charge. From a woman whose mom was in charge of the church kitchen.
Right.
So she thought this was Mrs. Peabody was in the right. And so that was the only
Oh
time I ever
man,
got pushback from a Mrs. Peabody story.
that is so
Um,
good. It's the thing is, over the years, I have I love to try to master the art of sermon illustration. And even if I find an illustration that's in a, like I probably have 20 of them on the shelf down here. Even if I find, yeah, I do. Even if I find a sermon illustration that let's say came from, Spurgeon or some just collection, or D.L. Moody, or just some collection of illustrations, I will try my very best to say, oh, here's the mechanics of that illustration and why it works. What's a story from my actual experience
Right.
that sort of mirrors that? And then and I usually can come up with one. And I collect, and I also collect experiences. But what's interesting is, one, that it's not that hard to find these kind of stories, and one of the things that when I've read your articles, I've thought, man, I don't know if he has in mind to do this, but I hope someday he collects all of these articles and puts them in reshapes it or whatever into something that could help. I mean, the more, I've had gray hair since I'm in my 20s, but the more gray it gets, and the longer that I'm in ministry, the more I think, oh gosh, for people entering the ministry, to have a better understanding of, what the actual mechanics of ministry are.
Right.
I like to think of myself as a real live theologian, but like my 15-year-old who wants to pursue the ministry, sometimes he's like, you shouldn't spend so much time having to mess with these petty things. And I'm like, brother, that's a lot of what I do. Because people come to church life with different expectations.
Oh, yeah.
Some people need you to be something that you're not. Some people are looking for something to control. I mean, and then some people it's just, sometimes like the Bible thing is like, you gave the Bible so the word of God could go forward.
Right.
Man, how about I go see if I have any change and let's buy some more Bibles,
And then she took it back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's like, for example, you could share with your son. There's one where it's in I think it's in the June 23rd, 23. No, it's not. Anyway, it's March 21st. Anyway, there's one called Mrs. Peabody and the Choir Robes.
Yeah, I read that.
And one of the aspects of that is when I first entered full-time, when I was first, I've been in full-time ministry now for 20 years. And so, which is phenomenal. It was absolutely insane.
I've been in full-time ministry about the same amount of time. And there's sometimes I think, how on earth have I done this for 20 years?
Yeah. So the first church that I was a solo pastor, actually the church where the lady took the Bibles, our mortgage was being paid by a very wealthy woman whose mother attended that church before she passed away. And you could tell your son could hear this, a seminarian could hear this, or a new pastor could hear this. Wow, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Wow, what a great gift. No, it was absolutely
I know
horrid.
where this is going. Yeah, right.
This is absolutely horrid because every conversation, Chris, was a carrot on a stick.
Yeah.
It was, I'm paying the bills, so you're going to do this. It was, and it came down to these awful choir robes that were ugly and heavy and warm, and for what? And at the time we barely had a choir. Yeah. And so, but in her mind, you're going to have a choir. You're going to have a choir because I'm paying this. It was absolutely horrid. It was absolutely horrid. That's the kind of thing you learn. You learn through experience and stuff. But that's how there was or like just the fun crazy things like Mrs. Peabody in the Christmas Miracle, where I actually had a gentleman who pretended to be deaf because his niece drove him crazy.
Oh boy.
And so Christmas Eve, early Christmas Eve, he's in the hospital. And as the story goes, if you want to look it up or whatever, but I'll tell you now. Early Christmas Eve, he's in the hospital. I'm going to go visit him. and he's Mrs. Peabody's nephew. I'm sorry, uncle. He's Mrs. Peabody's uncle, and
Right.
so single guy, that kind of thing. Well, almost 90, I think at the time, maybe even 90, and deaf. For all intents and purposes, cannot hear anything. And I'm there in the hospital room, and I'm just kind of holding his hand, and he knows who I am and stuff. And he's watching. What's funny is he's watching TV, and he's watching Looney Tunes.
Right.
He's watching Bugs Bunny, and I'm watching this. I'm thinking, well, maybe he's just kind of picking up on whatever's going on. And Bugs Bunny says something, and he laughs. The guy laughs.
Yeah.
And I look at him and I say, "You can hear." And he looks at me, and the conversation really was, yeah, but she drives me insane.
Yeah. I was with a certain family member. I won't put it out who it was. A certain family member connected to a church, and this old guy, same thing. He was probably in his early 90s, and I took him for a drive to see something he wanted to see. And about halfway through the drive, he says, "Hey, son, stop yelling. I can hear fine." And I said, "What are you talking about?" Because the way he had convinced everybody around him he was deaf. And I'm like, oh man, I'm going to remember that when I'm an old man.
Yeah.
That's
and that gentleman gave the church a sizable gift because I kept a secret. I'm just not gonna, but I'll never forget it. He was watching Bugs Bunny and he laughed, and I was just one of those moments where in ministry we're like, oh, okay.
And that's what I love about it, because there's I think this is a fantastic way. One, because also, this is practical theology. I mean, this is lived Christian faith in a lot of ways. This is some of the stuff, not just for people in ministry, but I think this could potentially, I don't know if you've ever got feedback this way, but this seems to me to be potentially, let's say, an instructive tool for the Mr. and Mrs. Peabodys of the church life, that if they read this, they're like, oh gosh, that thing I did, or that was I'm all the time saying, that sometimes people are just missing the point. They're asking the wrong questions. They're focused too much, on if I could, there's no way to, I think, properly do it, for me at least, in the context of this culture. But if I could, I would love to lose all the trappings of the maintenance of the building and all that stuff, so that you could be more free. But of course, in our culture, you kind of need the storefront, you kind of need the location. And even though First Congregational Church of Detroit, for example, is, by my way of thinking, the least congregational building I've ever seen, because it looks more like a cathedral. I love the space. I mean, I love beautiful spaces.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But a lot of these things, we get focused. It's like we're doing a food pantry. Don't get hyper focused on the way this thing's happening, or where somebody put the can of green beans, to borrow an example. When the point is, we're just being a blessing to people in ministering in that way, these sorts of things.
Right. And it can also go, what's interesting is it could also go the other way. It could also go, I have had a few conversations with church people who didn't like the stories, because they they just kind of hit too close to home.
Right.
And they hit too close to home, and they didn't like that.
Right.
We realized that. We realized that. And I had incredible, this is a number of years ago, but I had a wonderful conversation with two of our deacons, two wonderful ladies. And the one lady she doesn't like Mrs. Peabody. And the reason she doesn't like Mrs. Peabody is that some of her actions reflect her. And and she said out loud, she said, "Pastor Justin, I don't want you writing about me."
Yeah. Oh.
And the other deacon, another dear sweet lady, they're wonderful friends, thank goodness she could say this to her. She said, isn't the issue really that you're afraid that you are Mrs. Peabody? Because if you read these stories, this is not a good person.
Right.
This is not, this is not someone,
She's not very far along her journey of discipleship, let's say.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so let's talk about
Yeah.
that. Let's talk about that concern.
Yeah.
Before you're concerned that he's going to write about you, which I wouldn't do.
Oh,
which
yeah.
which
I have
wouldn't.
never once, I tell a story of one very egregious thing that happened in a church I pastored. It was I won't even get into it, but it was very egregious. And it's the only time that I could say honestly, only one time that I ever delivered a sermon that broke the rule that I learned from mentors and seminary. Hey, don't ever preach at somebody. And I fully agree. I've even coached others, don't do that. And in this particular instance, it was something that was, super overtly racist. And it just hit me. A deacon brought it to me and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. This is happening in this church. And I stood in front of everybody. I crumpled up the sermon notes. I said, look, I had a really nice sermon to share with you, but we're not doing that today. And I set it aside, and it was heavier than I like preaching to be, and more pointed. And the most amazing thing is, the person for whom I probably was preaching this for, it just went right over that person's head.
Yeah.
And it was like, hey, that was a great message. Somebody here needed to hear that. And I'm like, yeah, you. But the thing is a number of times, yeah, I've used an illustration and somebody's like, man, he must have been talking about me, or just the point of the sermon. And with that one exception, I have never done that. But you can see what the Holy Spirit does to in the hearts of people sometimes. They see themselves, and like, to coin a phrase from the South, when I served churches in Southern Virginia, there were some people who would say, there was a couple of ladies who used to say this, that was a good sermon, preacher. And that's how they prefer to call you preacher. Mm-hmm. She said, I don't feel like I went to church unless I got my toes stepped on. There was this, and or they would say, guess I should have worn my steel toes today. And it's, and the thing is, I'm not like a heavy finger wet. I'm not that guy.
Right.
And but I think, sometimes, it's a strange game that gets played, and Mrs. Peabody sort of highlights this. It's a strange game that gets played on the part of a lot of Christians. They say to the pastor, hey, we want this place to grow, but you can only do these things that we're used to. Right. We all want to grow closer to God, but then if it's like, hey, part of that is God's chipping away the rough parts of us, then it's right. Like for a lot of people, they don't want that.
Oh no, they don't, and it's because it's humbling. It's extremely humbling. Who wants to be humbled? Who wants to have to admit that they can grow, or they can learn, or they are wrong? Who wants to admit those things?
In my experience, what do you think about this? In my experience, okay, the folks who get, so there's a broad spectrum, but a lot of people who go into ministry, like I was frankly naive. I think I still am a little naive. I still live under the impression that one awesome sermon could just change somebody's life. And sometimes you see God use, sometimes you do see, right, like, oh, that the Holy Spirit used it. It's way beyond what you and I could have manufactured by our own speaking ability or influence or charisma or any of that. It definitely was a God thing. So that can still happen. But when you enter into ministry, especially early on, I think a lot of these kind of things are shocking. In my experience, it seems to me that a lot of folks who kind of get burned out and either stop being their most authentic self as a leader of churches, as a ministering to people, or some of the folks that exit ministry, it seems to me that a lot of times it's the collection of a lot of the petty. And because the average person who senses a call to ministry and wants to pursue that path, you got to be a little bit idealistic and say, oh, God can do great things. And then sometimes you get bogged down in this kind of, mundanity. For me, I know that over the years, it's like there could be, hundreds of instances where I know God moved, but then a few petty things like this can really be a horrible distraction.
Oh, hands down.
Yeah.
Hands down. And so I think for me, I think that answers the why question, at
Yeah.
least for me. I have been asked why, why do this? Why ride them? Why,
Yeah.
why spend the time to, and for me, it's therapeutic.
Oh,
For me,
yeah.
it's writing these events where I can look back, I can laugh, and I can let it go, and I can go, you know what, I don't get it, I don't,
Yeah.
I don't want to, but there are those number of peers, other pastors and such that go through these things, and it just bogs them down, and it just eventually just destroys them bit by bit. It's the what's the oh, this is an awful example, but there's that medieval, torture device, death of 1,000,
Well,
it's just
no,
like,
but it's like, yeah, it can be like
yeah,
that.
it's like it takes time, but it's eventually you're gonna,
I spent
fall.
my first eight, I graduated high school on a Friday. I was in Marine Corps boot camp on Sunday night. And I spent the first 8 years of my sort of adult formation in the Marine Corps on active duty. And then I spent a couple of years in the Army after that as I was transitioning into full-time ministry. And I started preaching when I was a Marine sergeant in rescue shelters and nursing homes and retirement communities at the mentorship of this retired Baptist preacher. And at any rate, I have occasionally said, I don't know how I could do ministry without having a little bit of the 10-foot tall bulletproof attitude of a Marine. And that's an unfortunate, if to the extent that that's true, and I'm probably exaggerating,
Right.
but to the extent that that's true, it's kind of an unfortunate commentary on, let's say, the state of affairs of daily church life sometimes. And that's not to say there's not all kinds of beauty. I mean, I wake up every day and I think, man, I could be out, digging a ditch somewhere, but which that would be honorable if that was where I was supposed to be. But I get, like, people will say, oh, you're so dedicated, whatever. It's like, no, I get to do this and meet people, even though sometimes it's in the messiest possible position,
Right.
petty, or somebody comes in off the street, as happens strangely often here, at the end of their rope. And it's like, I get to be the person God uses in people's lives like that. But, I tell you, you do need, and I hope folks get that in their formation. I had the best mentors. I mean, I had mentors from the most obscure retired Baptist preacher, Bill Ellerman, who was my first mentor, who I learned so much from, all the way to prominent guys like Ken Gangle, who I had the privilege to learn from, or Dr. Elmer Towns, a bunch of people that are super prominent, wrote a bunch of books. But that piece of ministry formation, and it's not just for pastors. When I invite somebody to become a deacon, or we're asking them, hey, would you think about being a trustee? I've seen some of the pettier sides of church life harm a person's faith, like someone who I
Right.
was helping lead to Christ, and then because of the high business position, the church insisted on asking him to be a trustee. My friend, he's not even in church anymore, and it was because he wasn't spiritually mature at a place to have, let's say, a proper framework, to deal with some of that, and it made him frankly question his faith altogether.
Sure.
When in fact, hey, this is a holy hospital. I mean, if it weren't for broken people, we wouldn't have a church.
Right. Well, no, it's the I think you hit the nail on the head, and I'll put it this way. I think the Mrs. Peabody stories resonate with so many people because it points out the imperfections of church life.
Yeah.
And it's that people are not perfect. There are imperfections. There's pettiness. There's this weirdness. There's craziness.
Yeah,
there's
Yeah.
people just and such. And you're right, though. You're right. When we hired, and she's phenomenal, but when we first hired our church secretary, we had that conversation where you're gonna see and hear a lot of junk, because people are, it's messy. Ministry is messy because people are messy.
That's right.
And if you only experience Sunday morning with the songs and the worship and the sermon and everybody is smiling and such, and then you get involved in leadership and you start experiencing some of that stuff that's going on in the background, it takes a strong faith to get through that. Or a strong faith to say, you know what, I'm just as messed up as that person is.
That's got to be the lesson, I think, too, right? That's got to be, because if you let because it's just like anything else. I mean, a few years ago, I jumped all the way back into getting back in good physical condition, and I had let that slide for a while. And I used to say, hey, I had a six-pack when I was a 21-year-old Marine. I don't have time for that anymore, and I don't ever plan on having a six-pack again. But I do spend a lot more time in the gym, ruck marching, riding the bike, continuing to do a lot of martial arts. And one of the things I have learned, the gym illustrates it well. There's a lot of people who stay out of the gym because they're like, no, that's where fit people go, and I don't look right. No, what are you kidding me? And the same thing is true of church. I know a woman in Illinois who is to this day a really faithful member of a church I served there, First Congregational Church of Peru, Illinois. And she came to church 4 Sundays in a row and sat in the parking lot, too afraid to go in. And there's a lot of things we could talk about that, as far as like making it welcoming, whatever, good signage. There's a lot of things you could talk about from a practical level. But where her heart was is she felt like, I need the Lord because I've got so many things in my mind, my heart, that I need to work out. Oh, but this is where saintly people go. But that's the opposite of the wide net that Jesus casted into the world that we're supposed to keep casting. So it's got to be it should be reassuring how messy it is. But sometimes we get it twisted.
Right. Now, this last story, Mrs. Peabody and the innkeeper, I switched gears. And the reason I switched gears a little bit was, you just kind of mentioned it just then, is that, with the lady in the parking lot and such, is that I wanted to focus on the innkeeper. I wanted to focus on Rupert Maximilius Peabody because I wanted to give, like for example, that woman in the parking lot or whomever, I wanted to give all the Ruperts that were reading this story their moment.
Oh yeah.
I wanted to give Rupert his moment.
Yeah.
Because the kid, even because of his name, the kid was destined to be bullied. The kid was destined to be the innkeeper. Yeah. He was never going to be Joseph. He was never going to be the angel. He was destined to be the innkeeper, and he was, destined to live his life as Rupert Maximilius Peabody. Right. But 95% of our churches are Rupert Maximilius Peabodys.
Right.
And so I wanted to give Rupert his moment. And that's, I think, and I have gotten so many emails and correspondence regarding that story. And of course they all end with, how much do you want for that donkey? And so, and if you have the opportunity, if you're listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, you have an opportunity to read it, read it. Read it and enjoy it, and glean whatever you can glean from it. But I think it's great. I read this and I thought it reminded me of a sermon I preached years ago that I should do more of. It's just a never-ending journey of how to connect and minister to people, right? I preached a sermon years ago called "The Other Brother," talking about the prodigal son. And what about the son who was there? What about the faithful son? Because like you said, that actually is way more people than the way the prodigal, the way I most often over the years had preached it was like, you're never too far from God. There's always, and that's true. God can redeem your circumstance. Very, evangelistic way of presenting that. I mentioned the prodigal son in Mrs. Peabody and the circus, and the whole idea. The whole idea joins the circus. The whole idea was that Mrs. Peabody was the other son, and but everyone loved her brother. Everyone loved her, you know, the one that came back, to church and such. And so she resented, you know, then you start resenting church, and you start resenting, you know, for in her mind, she started resenting the pastor. My father has a younger brother, and my father has a strong disdain for the story of the prodigal son, because he was the older brother that always was working hard. It was always there for his parents, and, you know, and all this stuff. And his younger brother was the one always getting in trouble with the law and owing money and taking money, and, you know, and it's like, what's going on?
Well, that's when I delivered that message. It was I didn't anticipate. I just was trying to be creative, and also I'm like, I've, you know, dealt with this text so many times. Let's just look for other ways to what are some of the truths that are latent in this text and not as obvious. And I did that sermon, and the organist at First Congregational Church of Sheboygan, Michigan, and the organist, a wonderful guy. He says he's like teary-eyed, which is not common. He's an engineer, you know, a serious guy, and a really smart guy. And anyway, he said, man, I never heard anything like that from this pulpit. And and he was behind me playing the organ, and it really resonated with him, because it can be, you know, Jesus is leaving the 99 to go after the one. It doesn't mean he doesn't care about the 99, you know, and it's interesting. Yeah.
I think the whole idea with the prodigal son, and, you know, the 99 to the one, and Mrs. Peabody and such, is that as pastors, we should be able to just say to our congregations, you know, we get it.
Yeah.
We get it. You know, you're not the prodigal son. You know, we get it. Or, you know, with Mrs. Peabody, I did have a woman, you know, that was raised in a ministry family. They traveled all over the country singing and such, and she wasn't musical. She didn't have an ear for music. So the rest of the parents and the rest of the siblings, they were all about it. And she just sat there in a pew. She just sat there in a chair every Sunday. Yeah. And after I was told that story, you know, this woman that just had this weird animosity towards me, after I was told that story, I mean, it opened my heart. It broke my heart, but opened my heart to her, and said, I get it. I get it. You know, I get it. I get it now. I cannot imagine my living my life in the shadows of everyone else, and being reminded Chris, can you imagine being reminded every concert, every Sunday, every whatever, you're not gifted like everyone else?
Right. Oh man,
can you imagine that?
I already am super jealous of pastors who can sing, because I can't sing. So sometimes when people say, "Hey, I really enjoy your preaching ministry," I say, "Hey, I pour it all into it because I can't sing." So I have to kind of sing in a different way. Yeah, can you? I mean, yeah, absolutely. So
I mean, it's one of those ideas. It's as pastors, you know, as the church, I mean, we should be able to say that. Should be able to communicate, hey, I get it. You know, that for a woman that was sitting in the parking lot for 4 weeks, I get it.
Oh, yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
When we started doing, we do 5 songs a Sunday, and it's 3 and 2. It's either 3 contemporary and 2 hymns, or 3 hymns and 2 contemporary. Sure. When we started really making that switch, you know, was there a pushback? Absolutely. You know, but that gave me an opportunity to go, I get it. I get it. You know, I always use the idea that for our senior adults, especially the ones that, you know, are, you know, quite senior and really push back with any type of change, is we shouldn't come to odds. We should be able to say, as pastors, as a church, you know, we get it, because everything else is changing.
Oh, right.
Everything else is changing around them. Most of these adults were raised with no phone in the home,
Right. Right.
and now look at us.
Yeah.
Look at the phone, automobiles,
Oh,
technology.
yeah.
Everything. Groceries. I mean, just everything has changed, and so many of them don't want the church to change because that's their constant.
Yeah.
They just give me this. Give me give me one day a week where I know nothing's going to be
Yeah.
out of the ordinary.
Oh, I think
And
it's among the reasons that I wish that, the NACCC and our type of church, it's one of the reasons I wish that we're not entirely obscure, but certainly we're not on the forefront of, a lot of people don't even know what congregational means. If I had a dime for
right,
every time someone asked me, what does congregational mean?
right,
And, but among the reasons that I would love to see, not so that we could just grow churches, but I think that there's something in the DNA of these type of churches, specifically this stream of continuing Congregationalists from the Pilgrims, this stream of the congregational way, let's say properly understood, in a sort of its broad but historic dynamic, is that I think many of our churches are still the places that we're not ignoring the future and the present. We're not doing that, but at the same time, we sort of seem to be among I think a minority of church movements that, rather than trying to grasp at the newest thing to build the church or whatever, where we still kind of we still honor some of that, and like, I mean, I still wear a robe. And I have friends that are, in much more contemporary church environments that are like, man, you need to get out of that robe, and you need to.
no,
And I'm like, I just still think there's a place for it, and God
right,
uses it. And then people say, well, you can't get young people. That's not true. That's not true at all, because I'm finding that not just the older generation loves it because it feels like church, some of that more traditional element, not throwing it all away. And then some younger people are like, I love it because because I'm going to step outside of a step outside of the normal things of life. I'm okay with singing a hymn, even though that's not going to be for everybody. But I think there's clearly still a role for that. To honor.
Absolutely, hands down. And this is a whole other. I mean, if you ever want to schedule, this is a whole other podcast.
Yeah, let's do it. We'll have that conversation.
I would most definitely want you to invite the Reverend Dr. Charles Packer for that conversation.
We should. Well, I think we could do one of these with you could be together in person, or we could just do it like this.
Because he puts it this way, the congregational way should be so very attractive to the world, to our country, and to the world, especially now. Because we've
with
spent
all the division and our cultural dynamic. It's not, and that's what's beautiful about it. It's not necessarily a doctrinal dynamic. It's something where we're saying, look, look, Jesus cast a broad net. Why shouldn't we? And I have people in this church that would, have me tell you which Republican to vote for on Sunday, or which like, I'm pretty broad. And then what we do is we say, no, we push all that out. We're doing church life here. That's what, and then people all the time are like, oh my gosh, it's so refreshing. I don't think I always am awake to how hard it is to find somewhere where you can go and focus on the spiritual life and be discipled and do things that are getting at the root of the sin problem, the disconnection problem, all that, as opposed to just trimming the hedges of, whatever is the latest social concern. And I'm not to say we should ignore those things, but yeah, we should be able to have somebody in the pew that doesn't see things exactly the same way.
Right. There's one quote. I wish I could find it, but there's one quote, and I know some of the listeners are going to be like, oh, he brought him up, and it's, how dare you, whatever. And I apologize ahead of time, but I love this quote. I love this quote. It's from Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House.
Sure.
And he said in an interview, he said, when I was Speaker of the House, I absolutely despised Bill Clinton. I mean, I just absolutely
For those of
despised
us
Bill
who were
Clinton.
there in that era, we would, yeah, that's easy to believe.
There, but then there's the pause, and
Yeah.
then he says, but he was he was my president. He was the commander in chief. He was the
Right.
president of the United States, and I was
Yeah.
the Speaker of the House. And I had to get to a point where I realized
Yeah.
we weren't going to get anything done if I refuse to speak to this man.
And we're losing that. That's the thing is,
It's
we're losing
well,
that.
that's kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Like we're bogged down in the petty, whether it's
Right. We're
church
bogged
life,
down in the right. We're bogged down
social
in the
life.
petty.
We're not thinking
Yeah.
about things. I would say, and if you look at the life of, man, the biggest influences on my ministry content and style is for sure Greg Boyd, who was my pastor in Minnesota, and the author of Letters from a Skeptic would be his. He's written a lot of books, but Greg. And then I stumbled upon Brennan Manning, and it really, what it did was when I started reading Brennan Manning, I don't know, 20 years ago or whatever, I thought, oh, okay, so in fact, yeah, the whole ragamuffin gospel thing, because that's what I felt like, and I'm like, this is a gospel for everybody, because it's been reinforced living here in Naples, serving churches, because there's a part of me that really didn't want to not live, like I was really enjoying the connections I was making in the city in Detroit. I took some mission team to the juvenile detention center. Like, I like gritty life. I miss Haiti. I can't be there right now. I like that. I feel like, but then, you could go right over here to Gordon Drive, where there's literally $85 million mansions. Guess what? Those people need Jesus exactly the same. Whether I'm over there or I'm out in Immokalee speaking Creole, it doesn't matter. This gospel is for everybody. And if your version of what you're presenting as the gospel, if it can't preach everywhere, then I think you should reconsider what you're saying. Because Jesus, he's going to the heights, he's going to the depths, and so, yes, we should. Who else would be good in that conversation for us? I don't know if you know Andy Stenson up in Massachusetts. He's at Fall River.
Yeah, I do know.
Yeah.
I know Andy. Yeah,
he's got a lot of
Andy.
He's got a lot of great thoughts on this. I quote him all the time. I should pay him. I should pay him royalties. I quote him so much. From this one thing he says. Oh gosh, how does he say it? Modernity is poisoned with rationality, and what he's trying to get at is like, hey, don't forget about the intrinsic spiritual nature of this life, and just good. But yeah, I think you're pointing to a lot of this. This is great. I love these series. I think that through her life, you can do like what you did here too. You can talk. It can be her. It can be my wife. She had never read one of these, and I started telling her about doing this with you today, and she was like, what's going on? Is only Mrs. Peabody's the problem? I said, no, you got to read them. Everybody's the problem. I'm like, no, you got to read them.
You can tell her this before we close, but in the next one, I'm working on another one, and it's Mrs. Peabody and the Professor.
Nice.
And within it, the roles are switched.
Yeah.
She's not the antagonist in the situation that she's in, and I found it very interesting to write.
Yeah.
But I wanted, in a way, I guess I'm going to share this, and you can take it however you want. But within it, I attack. I shouldn't use that word, but I attack academics.
Hey,
I attack.
There's plenty worth attacking. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I attack academics. And so So I create.
She could bring her. Yeah, I can imagine 100 ways you could. She could bring her sass, or something into that environment and actually highlight. I mean, I could see a lot of ways you could.
Yeah, and she does, and so I'm excited about that. But you can tell your wife that I kind of put all the negative stuff into someone else this upcoming
I'll do it.
this
I'll do
upcoming
it.
one.
I
And then
said,
also,
yeah.
you could also tell her this too, that I have been told more than once that there are male Mr. Peabodys out there,
100%.
and I should highlight the male version of
Yeah.
Mrs. Peabody. So
Well,
I
think
will
it's
close.
great.
I will close with this. And this
Yeah.
is the funniest. This is a funny story. And for those of you who, for those of you who are listening, who are Congregationalists and possibly Congregationalists in the New England area, in the Old South Church of Boston, Massachusetts,
Yeah.
there is a sign above a stairway that says, from 1843 or something like that, musical instruments donated by Mrs. Peabody and family.
Nice. Is that where you got the inspiration for the name?
No, you know what? I don't know.
That just was one of those serendipitous.
The new Peabody is a very, I don't know where I came up with the name per se, but I have found out that Peabody is actually a very common New England name.
Huh.
New England last name.
Oh yeah. So that's awesome. Well, hey, listen, how can people go? Obviously, they can pick up the Congregationalist. Any church in the NA, I think, almost just by default gets a few of these. Right. And then, of course, people can go, online. Online, naccc.org/the Congregationalist.
Yeah.
And you can, in fact, I love the way that tool that you can read them online. It even makes the sound of a page flipping.
Right.
So they can be accessed there. What about your church? I've been in that place for a couple of meetings, and I love that church building. I think it's great, and it just has a good spirit. You can tell there's a good spirit in that church. And I have always, from the day I met you, when I told my wife I was going to do this morning, and she's like, "Who's that?" And I started to say, that guy I told you, he kind of this is flattering for you if you know me, that he kind of reminds me of myself a little bit, because he just is straightforward. He seems to just love the Lord. And from the first time I met you, I thought, oh, that's one of the good guys right there. And they're just a good. So how do they go? Is it what's the website or online for the church?
Oh, our search is sandstonechurch.org. All one word, sandstonechurch.org. And then if you go, we have our Sandstone Congregational Facebook page, of course.
Yeah.
And then if you go on YouTube, if anybody's interested in watching our worship services and anything like that, you go on YouTube and just search Sandstone Congregational Church.
Yep.
Everything's there. As many churches, we really upped our game before, during, and after COVID when it came to technology and stuff like that. So we have a very, I would say, not super strong, but we have a significant online presence.
Yeah.
And such.
Yeah,
so
ours is growing here in ways that we've up our game with the equipment and so on. And just the other day, I found out that one of my neighbors, who I didn't even know they knew who I was, they're watching every service online. And so I have a gift bag I've had in my car all week that I have to stop by and say, hey,
that's awesome.
Well, that online,
Yeah. And then like you said, with the Congregationalist, it's, NACCC.org/Congregationalist. And we do have a new editor. She just graduated the magazine. She just graduated from Harvard.
Really?
And so she
well, I hope she doesn't edit. I always joke how I have a doctorate, but it's from a good old fundamentalist school.
Yeah. So Maggie,
hopefully she doesn't tear apart my articles.
Harvard Divinity School with a master in theological studies.
Oh wow.
Before that, she pursued religious studies as an undergraduate at West Virginia University.
Okay.
So
I think she just started in the last few months, right?
She just started. Yeah. The March issue will be her first solo issue that she's working on, and such. And so, so it is a great resource, a great magazine. Even if you don't attend a congregational church and you want to read some of that stuff,
there's good stuff in there, and it's very and you get some different perspectives, which is what's
absolutely
for me interesting for me. you got, I'm writing in there occasionally about missions and you got this, and then like, yeah, I didn't even know that Daniel Livingston, I was just messaging him, had written this article. I hadn't seen it. And I mean, you got in any one of these, you could read something. Oh, that's perfect for me. And then something might challenge you, and then something else might really encourage you.
That actually brings up a great point. I took a break for about 2 years from with Mrs. Peabody. I took a break, right. And I would get emails, or someone would visit, like our executive director visited a church in rural Maine, and one of the members came up to her and said, "Hey, what happened to Mrs. Peabody?" And such. Right. And this is rural Maine, and she couldn't wait to tell me this. And the reality is that the Congregationalist was tasked to focus on some racial justice issues.
Sure.
And because they were tasked to focus on racial justice issues, I had a conversation with the then editor Marion King, and I said, I can't connect her being Mrs. Peabody to that,
right,
in a way that would be not offensive.
Oh, sure.
It's
I just
couldn't. I mean, here's the thing. Here's the funny thing, and I'll share this with you. I haven't shared this with anyone, and I'll share this with you on the podcast. Anybody who's listening, who's going to be listening, is I actually toyed with a story that was just titled "Mrs. Peabody and the Klan."
Well, no,
and it was just that. It was just, I was like, I can't, there's no way. There's just no way. I have no way of putting her in that context at all. So I had to take a break. So if you're wondering why there's isn't a number of Mrs. Peabody articles for about 2 years.
Yeah, I went back looking at it, and I was like, I thought these were in every one. And no. I'm glad you're doing them again. I think it's a great I'm glad to highlight it too for anybody who hears this or watches this. And man, I sure appreciate it, Justin. I really do.
Is awesome.
Thanks for the time. We'll do that again. We'll soon. We'll see. Maybe we can get Charles and maybe Andy. I think you can have. I know you can have multiple people on a Zoom meeting. So we just have to see how to do that. And I'll be in touch soon. So God bless you today, and thank you so much.
God bless. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Hey, you too. Talk to you again. Okay, bye-bye.